How did General George S. Patton shatter the impossible German river defenses in just 6 hours while defying direct orders from Eisenhower's high command during the brutal winter of 1944? As the Saar River turned into a churning graveyard of mud and steel, Patton gambled the lives of his Third Army on a reckless engineering miracle that no sane commander would have dared, proving that in the furnace of the Second World War, the difference between a catastrophic defeat and a legendary victory often rested on the edge of a single, defiant decision. Driving rain lashed against the windshield of the command jeep as General George S. Patton leaned forward, his eyes fixed on the swollen, turbulent waters of the Saar River, which had become a jagged scar across the landscape of Western Europe. By November 1944, the Allied momentum that had carried them from the beaches of Normandy to the very doorstep of the German Reich began to grind into a punishing, bloody stalemate. The Supreme Allied Commander, Dwight D. Eisenhower, faced a logistical nightmare that threatened to freeze the entire liberation of Europe in its tracks, while General Omar Bradley urged caution, fearing that the stretched supply lines could no longer support the aggressive thrust Patton so desperately craved. This strategic friction was not merely a disagreement over maps and pins, but a fundamental clash of military philosophies, where Eisenhower's broad front strategy aimed for a steady, low-risk advance across the entire continent, while Patton believed in a single thrust that would pierce the German heartland like a rapier. Beneath the leaden skies of a dying year, the Third Army found itself staring at the West Wall, a formidable belt of concrete bunkers and tank traps known to the world as the Siegfried Line, where German defenders prepared to bleed the American forces white. This was not merely a battle of soldiers, but a battle against the elements themselves, as the worst autumn rains in 20 years transformed the French countryside into a primordial soup of waist-deep mud that swallowed tanks and broke the spirits of men. Patton, however, possessed a psychological makeup that refused to acknowledge the word impossible, viewing every obstacle not as a barrier but as a personal insult to his destiny as a conqueror. He often sat in his mobile headquarters, surrounded by the ghosts of ancient Roman legions and Napoleonic cavalry, convinced that he was a reincarnation of warriors who had crossed these same rivers centuries before. While the higher echelons of Allied command debated the merits of a broad front strategy, Patton looked at the raging Saar River and saw the jugular of the German defense, believing that a lightning-fast crossing could bypass the primary fortifications of the Siegfried Line before the enemy could reinforce them. The German First Army, commanded by the capable and resilient General Hermann Balck, relied on the river as a natural moat, convinced that no modern army could bridge such a torrent under the murderous observation of their well-positioned artillery. The Saar was not just a river at this moment. It was a raging, debris-strewn monster, its current running at over 8 knots, enough to flip a small boat or wash away an unanchored bridge section in seconds. Balck knew that Patton was his most dangerous adversary, yet even he underestimated the sheer velocity at which the American general intended to strike, assuming that the technical requirements of a river crossing would take days or even weeks to organize. Inside the dimly lit headquarters of the Third Army, Patton paced like a caged predator, his ivory-handled revolvers glinting in the lamplight as he dictated orders that bypassed the cautious timelines established by his superiors. He understood that the German defense was a brittle shell, one that required a sharp, decisive blow to crack wide open. But that blow required his engineers to achieve what many considered a mathematical impossibility. Patton's staff officers whispered about the risks, but the general's response was always the same. A pint of sweat will save a gallon of blood, a mantra that he expected every man under his command to live by, regardless of the cost to their own physical limits. Executing a river crossing is among the most complex operations in military science, requiring the seamless orchestration of infantry, armor, and engineering units under a single unified purpose. Patton summoned his chief engineers and issued a command that sounded more like a death sentence. They were to span the Saar River in 6 hours, a time frame so compressed it defied every manual written by the United States Army Corps of Engineers. These men were not just builders. They were combatants who would have to work in the freezing water while German snipers and machine gunners rained lead down from the high ground. The technical challenges were staggering, as the engineers had to calculate the buoyancy of the M2 Treadway pontoons against the increasing weight of the flooding river, while simultaneously avoiding the iron sleet of German mortar fire that was already zeroing in on the banks. The dilemma facing Patton was profound, as he knew that every hour his men spent on the near side of the river allowed the Germans to zero in their heavy guns. Yet a premature crossing without adequate bridging would leave his infantry trapped on the far bank with no hope of armored support. His ego, often criticized by his peers, became the fuel for this operation, as he felt the crushing weight of history demanding that he outshine his rivals, Montgomery and Bradley, by achieving a feat of arms that would resonate through the ages. He famously told his subordinates that he didn't want to hear about holding positions, because the only thing Patton held was the enemy by the throat while he kicked them in the rear. Fear was a luxury Patton could not afford, and he projected an aura of absolute certainty that masked the immense pressure of knowing that a failure here would lead to the total annihilation of his forward elements. The psychological warfare began long before the first boat hit the water, as Patton utilized deceptive radio traffic and phantom movements to convince the Germans that his main effort was miles away from the actual point of attack. He ordered his supply trucks to run their engines all night in the north to draw Balk's reserves away, while the real engineers were moving in total silence toward the southern bend of the river, where the current was the most treacherous, but the defenses were the thinnest. As the clock ticked toward the midnight hour of the assault, the American engineers moved their heavy equipment through the darkness, muffled by the relentless downpour that hid the sounds of clanking metal and revving engines from the German sentries. They carried the heavy pontoon sections and steel girders through the mire, their breath hitching in the cold air as they prepared to face the most grueling 6 hours of their lives. Each engineer carried over 80 pounds of gear through mud so thick it could pull the boots right off a man's feet, yet they moved with a grim, silent purpose, knowing that their speed was the only shield they had against the German 88mm guns waiting on the ridge. Patton's mindset was a volatile mix of tactical genius and desperate aggression, driven by the belief that his soldiers could achieve anything if led with enough fire and brimstone. He frequently visited the front lines, his presence a jarring contrast to the muddy, exhausted infantrymen, yet his booming voice and unwavering confidence acted as a tonic to their frayed nerves. He was a man who understood that in the chaos of 1944, the Allied supply lines were crumbling, and the only way to win was to break the German will before the American industrial machine ran out of fuel and ammunition. The action began with a thunderous roar as hundreds of American artillery pieces opened fire simultaneously, illuminating the night sky with a hellish orange glow that signaled the start of the crossing. This was not a creeping barrage, but a violent, concentrated wall of steel designed to suppress the German batteries and keep the defenders' heads down while the engineers rushed to the water's edge. The ground shook with a primal force that could be felt for miles, a mechanical earthquake that signaled the end of the German occupation of the Saar Line. Immediately, the first wave of infantry pushed their small assault boats into the churning Saar, the current threatening to sweep them downstream into the waiting muzzles of German machine guns. The men paddled with a desperate intensity, the river surface erupting in geysers of water as mortar rounds began to find their mark, turning the crew a chaotic scramble for survival. In these boats were the young men of the 95th Infantry Division, the Iron Men of Metz, who had already seen enough horror to last a lifetime, but were now being asked to swim through a river of fire. Just like that, the engineers began their work, sliding the first pontoon into the river even as bullets whined off the metal frames and splattered into the mud around them. They worked with a rhythmic precision born of endless training, ignoring the screams of the wounded and the terrifying whistle of incoming shells, to focus on the bolts and cables that would hold the bridge together. The M2 Treadway was a masterpiece of modular design, but in the hands of exhausted men in a freezing river, it was a heavy, stubborn beast that required brute strength and sheer willpower to tame. Each man knew that the entire success of the Third Army's winter campaign rested on their shoulders, for without the bridge, the infantry on the far bank would be cut off and slaughtered by the inevitable German counterattacks. Patton watched from a nearby observation post, his binoculars pressed to his eyes, counting every minute as if it were a drop of blood being spilled for the sake of his reputation and the Allied cause. He knew that if the bridge wasn't finished by dawn, the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, might finally make an appearance, turning the bridgehead into a killing field. The sheer audacity of the operation began to paralyze the German response, as local commanders scrambled to understand how the Americans were building a bridge in conditions they had deemed impassable. Reports reached General Balk that American tanks were already idling on the near bank, ready to roar across the span the moment the last plank was laid, creating a sense of panic within the German ranks. The Germans had relied on the general winter to protect them, but they had not counted on the industrial fury of the American Engineering Corps. This was the tactical surprise Patton had envisioned, a lightning strike that bypassed the slow, methodical buildup of traditional warfare to seize the initiative through raw, unadulterated speed. The Saar River, once a formidable protector of the German Reich, was being conquered by the grit of American engineers and the iron will of a general who refused to wait for permission to win the war. The freezing spray of the Saar River lashed against the faces of the engineers of the 113th Engineer Combat Group as they grappled with the heavy steel treadway sections, their fingers numbing against the frigid metal while German shells began to bracket the crossing site with terrifying precision. Every second felt like an eternity in this cauldron of noise and fire, where the sheer mechanical violence of the Second World War met the raw, unyielding courage of men pushed beyond the limits of human endurance by a commander who refused to accept the word impossible. The engineers had to anchor the bridge into the treacherous, shifting mud of the far bank while dodging the direct fire of German snipers who were hidden in the upper floors of the stone houses in Dillingen. General George S. Patton knew that the window of opportunity was closing rapidly as the German First Army began to realize that the frantic activity at the river's edge was not a diversion, but the primary spearhead of a massive American thrust aimed at the heart of the Saarland. The water itself seemed to conspire against the American effort, rising inches every hour as the autumn deluges continued to pour from the leaden sky, turning the river into a churning, debris-filled monster that threatened to tear the half-finished bridge from its moorings. Patton's gamble was reaching its peak of danger. If the bridge broke now, he would have 3 battalions of infantry stranded with no way to retreat and no way to receive the heavy anti-tank guns they needed to survive a panzer counterattack. Just like that, a German 88mm battery hidden in the tree line on the far bank found its range, sending a screaming projectile into the muddy bank mere yards from a stack of pontoon floats. The resulting explosion showered the engineers with shards of frozen earth and jagged shrapnel. But there was no time to seek cover and no time to mourn the fallen because Patton's orders were absolute, and the momentum of the entire Third Army depended on the steel spine being built across the water. The men of the 113th continued their work with a grim, machine-like focus, stepping over their own wounded comrades to ensure that the next treadway section was locked into place before the next salvo of German shells arrived. Immediately, the American counter-battery fire roared into life as long-range howitzers positioned miles to the rear began to hammer the German positions, creating a rhythmic, earth-shaking duel of giants that turned the river valley into a landscape of fire and smoke. Beneath this canopy of screaming steel, the engineers moved with a desperate, practiced fluidity, sliding the massive steel tracks onto the floating pontoons and bolting them together with a speed that defied the technical manuals of the era. This was the pinnacle of American industrial war, a seamless integration of heavy machinery, overwhelming fire support, and the unbreakable spirit of the individual G1. They were building what many military historians would later call the Bridge of Destiny, a fragile umbilical cord of metal that would soon carry the weight of 30-ton Sherman tanks into the teeth of the German defenses. On the far bank, the American infantry who had crossed in the first wave of assault boats were currently fighting for their lives in the ruins of small stone villages, their ammunition running low as they waited for the armor relief that only the bridge could provide. The street fighting was house to house and room to room, a brutal war of attrition where the Americans used grenades and bayonets to clear out German defenders who were determined to hold every inch of their homeland. General Hermann Balck, observing the situation from a distant command post, grew increasingly frustrated by the inability of his forces to collapse the American bridgehead, realizing too late that Patton had gambled on the one thing the German high command had discounted: the sheer speed of American engineering. Balck ordered a desperate counterattack by the surviving elements of the 17th SS Panzergrenadier Division, hoping to push the American infantry back into the river before the tanks could cross. Yet his units found themselves bogged down in the same soul-crushing mud that had plagued the Allied advance for weeks. The German panzers, despite their superior armor and guns, were helpless against the primordial sludge of the Saar Valley, which acted as a natural trap that neutralized their mobility. The psychological impact of seeing a bridge appear where there had been only a raging river hours before began to shatter the morale of the German defenders, who had been told that the Saar was an impassable barrier. Patton, standing on a ridge overlooking the valley, checked his watch with a predatory grin, knowing that he was minutes away from achieving a tactical miracle that would force the hand of his cautious superiors in the Allied High Command. He had ignored the directives from Bradley's headquarters to halt and consolidate, knowing that in war a pause is often just an invitation for the enemy to recover and strike back with greater force. Suddenly the last steel pin was driven home, and the bridge stood complete, a swaying metal path across the abyss that had claimed so many lives during the long, bloody night of the crossing. Without waiting for a formal inspection, the lead tank of the 4th Armored Division revved its engine, the black exhaust belching into the gray morning air as the massive machine rolled forward onto the bridge, the metal pontoons groaning and sinking deep into the water under the immense weight. The sight of the first Sherman tank reaching the far bank was a moment of pure electric relief for the infantry, who had been holding the bridgehead with nothing but their rifles and their courage. The crossing of the first tank was a moment of pure, visceral triumph that signaled the end of the German river defense, as more Shermans followed in a relentless, clanking procession that poured across the Saar like a flood of steel. These tanks did not stop to consolidate. They moved immediately into the attack, their 75mm guns barking as they engaged German anti-tank nests that had been harassing the infantry throughout the night. The silence of the morning was shattered by the roar of American engines and the clatter of tank tracks on the steel treadway. This was the realization of Patton's doctrine of violence, speed, and then more speed, a philosophy that viewed the lives of his men as a currency to be spent boldly to buy a faster victory and a shorter war. The German lines, once a coherent belt of fire and concrete, began to disintegrate into a series of isolated pockets as the American armor bypassed strong points and raced into the rear areas of the First Army. Patton's cavalry spirit was alive and well as his tanks hunted down retreating German units and destroyed the command and control structure of the enemy before they could regroup. But the cost of this reckless speed was etched into the faces of the engineers, who collapsed in the mud near the bridgeheads, their clothing soaked with freezing water and their hands bleeding from the jagged edges of the steel they had wrestled into place. They had achieved the impossible in less than 6 hours, defying the raging current and the murderous German fire to provide the Third Army with the gateway it needed to breach the Siegfried Line. These men would never receive the same fame as the tank commanders or the paratroopers, but without their anonymous heroism in the freezing mud of the Saar, the liberation of Europe might have taken months longer. As the sun struggled to break through the thick canopy of winter clouds, the sheer scale of the American achievement became visible, with thousands of men and hundreds of vehicles pouring across the Saar in a logistical feat that overwhelmed the German ability to respond. Patton's gamble had paid off, not because of a lack of risk, but because he understood that in war, the most dangerous course of action is often the most predictable one. By choosing the most difficult crossing point and the most impossible timeline, he had guaranteed that the Germans would be caught entirely unprepared for the weight of the assault. By bypassing the traditional timelines and forcing his men to work under conditions that bordered on the suicidal, he had achieved a level of tactical surprise that was virtually unheard of in the static, grinding warfare of the Western Front in late 1944. The Saar River crossing became a blueprint for future operations, proving that the American military's greatest strength was its ability to combine industrial might with a rugged frontier-style improvisation. It was a victory of the assembly line as much as the front line, showing that the Americans could build their way out of any tactical dilemma that the Germans could devise. In the days that followed, the breakthrough at the Saar would force the German High Command to divert precious reserves from other sectors, including units that were being husbanded for the upcoming Ardennes offensive, thereby indirectly weakening the blow that would eventually become the Battle of the Bulge. Patton's defiance of orders was not merely an act of ego, but a calculated maneuver by a commander who lived and breathed the history of warfare, believing himself to be the reincarnation of ancient warriors who understood that fortune favors the bold. He had sensed the weakness in the German line and struck it with all the power at his disposal, refusing to let the bureaucratic caution of the high command dictate the pace of his victory. The landscape of the Saarland was now a graveyard of German ambitions, littered with the burned-out husks of panzers and the discarded equipment of a retreating army that could no longer hold the line against the American juggernaut. As the bridge continued to funnel the power of the Third Army into the German heartland, the memory of those 6 hours of madness on the riverbank remained a testament to the engineers who built a path to victory out of steel, sweat, and fire. The Saar River, which the Germans had hoped would be their salvation, had instead become the highway for their destruction. Ultimately, the story of the Saar River is the story of the human spirit's ability to overcome the most daunting physical and psychological barriers when driven by a singular, unwavering purpose. It reminds us that history is not made by those who follow the rules, but by those who have the vision to see a way through the chaos and the courage to take the first, terrifying step across the water. General George S. Patton, for all his flaws and his controversial ego, understood this truth better than almost any other commander in the Second World War, leaving behind a legacy of defiance that still echoes through the annals of military history today. If you were a commander in Patton's position, would you have risked the lives of your engineers to gain a tactical surprise? Or would you have followed orders and waited for the weather to clear at the cost of losing the momentum of the invasion? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell.